And with that, we are on then to talking about inductive arguments. And just like we saw with deductive arguments, there are typical kinds of inductive arguments that we can identify, and that will easily, hopefully, tell us that they are inductive in nature. So first of all, we can look at predictions, right? And of course, I'm saying the obvious here, but predictions are about the future. So we might take this example. The Mariners won yesterday and the day before that against the Athletics, so they should beat the A's again today. So the conclusion comes after the word "so" there, is our conclusion indicator. The Mariners should beat the A's again today is clearly not being asserted as a guarantee, right? They say they should beat. It's a likelihood they feel. They might be right or wrong about it, but certainly this person feels that the conclusion is likely given the two premises there, or the one compound premise there. And so the idea here is anytime your conclusion is about something that hasn't happened yet, it's about the future, it's a prediction. The future being uncertain then, right, will mean that we're dealing with an inductive argument. Okay, so when your conclusion is about the future, we're dealing with an inductive argument. I guess this is a good point to mention as well. Remember in 1.2, I encouraged you not to really worry too much about distinguishing between the various types of non-arguments, right? Whether it be, a matter of asserting an opinion or a matter of belief. However, just to give a couple quick examples there, however, when it comes to identifying the different types of deductive and inductive arguments, you do need to be able to distinguish between them. In other words, on the exam coming up, I'll ask you at one point to tell me if a particular argument is deductive or inductive, and then I'll ask you to go beyond that and tell me what type of deductive or inductive argument it is, even to the extent that you'll need to tell me, oh, that is a hypothetical syllogism versus a disjunctive syllogism, for example, or you would need to tell me, oh, it's a prediction as opposed to, let's say, an argument from analogy, as we see here. All right, so let's look at those. An argument from analogy occurs when you have two or more things that are compared, and people conclude that because the first item has characteristics x, y, and z, and the second item also has characteristics x and y, it must therefore have z as well. So just quickly, to give you a graphical representation, this is item 1, that's item 2, and we're saying here that 1 has x, y, and z, and then we notice that 2 has x and y. We might conclude, oh, does it have z as well? Well, an argument from analogy concludes that it does, in fact, have z as well. More specifically, let me give you an example. I might tell you, I loved Douglas Copeland's collection of short stories entitled Life After God. So here's our conclusion indicator. So his new collection of short stories, Polaroids from the Dead, should be great as well. Right? So what I'm saying here, we can kind of map this onto this scheme here that I have on the screen or on that previous slide. So I'm saying essentially that item number 1 here is this book, Life After God, and I'm saying I loved it. I'm also saying it was by Douglas Copeland, that's Y, and it was a collection of short stories, that was X. So now I take item 2, a book entitled Polaroids from the Dead, and I know that it's a collection of short stories. It has characteristic X in common, and I know that it was written by Douglas Copeland. And so since I love the first item that had those 3 characteristics, I'm going to conclude that it should have Z as well. In other words, that I will love it as well. So clearly this is a kind of thinking that we use all the time in our everyday lives, but now we're going to go ahead and give this name to it. It's called an argument from analogy. Now, one thing to emphasize here with regard to arguments from analogy is that arguments from analogy are always concluding about a specific item here, okay? So in this case, it's concluding specifically about this book, Polaroids from the Dead. I'm emphasizing that because in the next slide here, when we talk about inductive generalizations for many people seem similar to arguments from analogy, but an inductive generalization has a bit of a different kind of conclusion. So in an argument from analogy, you're always comparing two things, and you're comparing two things and you conclude something about one specific item. All right. But to illustrate this, right, or at least to get into the confusion here, the possible confusion, it's when we deal with inductive generalizations. So inductive generalizations is when happen when we come to a conclusion about all the members of a group based on a small sample of that group, right, a select set of examples. So for example, if I said George W. Bush and Dick Cheney have accepted donations from Enron in the past, thus it is clear that all Republicans have accepted donations from Enron in the past. This is clearly an inductive generalization. I'm taking an example of two individuals, Bush and Cheney, and they've accepted donations from Enron, and they're also, of course, we would know as background knowledge that they're Republicans. And so from these two examples, I'm going to conclude about what? All Republicans then are like them based on this sample, very small sample, of just two individuals. So you might notice here that basically inductive generalizations are really the basis for, prejudice, right? Forming prejudices or biases. Oh, you see a couple examples of people from a certain group who act in a certain way, and sometimes people will conclude then all the members of that group must act in that way, and that is an inductive generalization. And in many, many cases, in most cases I would suggest, inductive generalizations don't turn out to be particularly, we'll call them cogent arguments when we get to 1.4, excuse me. They don't turn out to be very persuasive, or they ought not be very persuasive arguments. But the key here to distinguish inductive generalizations from arguments from analogy is right here in this word all, right? Inductive generalizations conclude about all of a group, whereas arguments from analogy conclude about a particular item rather than all of a group, right? So I'm just here encapsulating what I just said. Analogies conclude about a limited number of things, one or just a few things, and then inductive generalizations conclude about all of a certain group. So we also have arguments from authority as an inductive argument. So this is whenever you come to a conclusion based on information from an expert or other authority. So if I told you, political commentator David Brooks says that Senator Maria Cantwell has met with leaders of the Palestine Liberation Organization, thus Cantwell has met with leaders of the PLO. Well, we want to ask ourselves, why do I believe Cantwell has met with leaders of the PLO? Apparently I believe that because what? This person, David Brooks, says it's true. So essentially, anytime you offer an argument and you come to a conclusion based on what somebody else has stated is the case, that is an argument from authority. Now, we might have a lot of faith in David Brooks or whoever the authority is that we're citing. We might think that they're a very reliable source of information on whatever the topic is. However, we also have to say, or remember at the same time, that nobody is perfect, nobody is infallible, and that's really what makes this type of argument inductive, right? Even if David Brooks is a very reliable person, that will never guarantee that what he has said is true. And if without a guarantee, we're dealing with an inductive argument. Now, there's a very similar kind of inductive argument to arguments from authority called an argument based on signs. And so the difference here is that some kind of sign will replace the person as the source of knowledge. So imagine we're in a natural history museum, and I say, oh, look, that placard there says that this piece of rock came from the moon, right? Like the placard next to the display. I then apparently have said, well, wow, pretty amazing to be looking at a piece of the moon, right? So apparently I'm Canadian here. Just kidding, right? Throwing in the word A there at the end doesn't mean I'm Canadian. To suggest as much would be a faulty inductive generalization. Nonetheless, this person, whoever's offering this argument, concludes that they're looking at a piece of the moon. And why do they believe that? Because a placard says so. Now, if we're in a reputable natural history museum, it's very likely that placard will be accurate. And so it's a good thing to do to believe whatever the placard says. It's a reasonable thing to do. However, we know that sometimes things get screwed up, and so even though the placard might say that you're looking at a piece of the moon there, it might be a mistake, right? It might be misplaced, or maybe somebody's playing a joke on this person and they switched the sign for the piece of the moon with the sign for the piece of the Berlin Wall or something, and they were kind of confused about why the piece of the moon had graffiti on it or whatever. I mean, things can happen. that would mean that this conclusion is not guaranteed by the premise, though, again, the person certainly thinks it's likely based on the premise. Okay, so as I'm saying here, it probably is a piece of the moon, but it could also be time to trick the Canadian, if that is a Canadian. So with no guaranteed conclusion, it definitely is an inductive argument. All right, causal arguments then are also another kind of inductive argument. Note that I've spelled it as causal, and the other spelling here to the right is casual. It's a very different kind of thing. A casual argument, it's not really a big deal, I guess, if it's casual. But causal arguments are when we conclude that one thing caused something else based on some kind of evidence. So imagine you have natural gas service to your home, and when you go home today, you think to yourself as you walk in, my home smells like rotten eggs, and then you think, and I have a gas stove, so you conclude, I must have a natural gas leak. This is a very important and I think reliable conclusion, right? If you go home and you have gas service to your home and you smell rotten eggs when you walk into your home, it is very likely that you have a natural gas leak, and you should not light a candle to go investigate, what the problem is or anything like that. That would be a bad idea. So, you here are speculating about what caused the smell, the rotten egg smell. And anytime you're talking about cause and effect, we're dealing with an inductive argument. Is it guaranteed that you have a natural gas leak in this scenario? It's not guaranteed. Maybe you have rotten eggs. Maybe somebody, is playing a joke on you and put a stink bomb in your house or wherever you might live. Who knows what the actual situation might be, but it is likely based on these premises, but not guaranteed. And so any causal argument, even one that sounds very, very likely, will not be deductive, but rather inductive. Okay, so causal arguments then, just last thing to add here, are always about specific instances. All right. Now finally, there is one kind of argument that can be either deductive or inductive, and that would be an argument from science. And arguments that deal with newly developing science are inductive. Arguments that deal with well-established science are deductive. Another way to think of this is to realize that deductive scientific arguments deal with applications of known scientific laws. So if I told you, if we took this argument, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, therefore when this water gets to 100 degrees Celsius, it will boil. Now that's a deductive argument, right? Because we've known for a long time that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. On the other hand, if I have some newly discovered substance X fresh from Mars and I'm testing it in the laboratory, and I say to myself, well, I've been able to boil this newly discovered substance at 75 degrees Celsius twice, and before I raise the temperature of this substance a third time, I think, or I believe, or I conclude that when it gets to 75 degrees Celsius for the third time, it will boil once again. Now, since it's only the third time, perhaps in all of history, that this stuff has been raised to 75 degrees Celsius, we don't know if it would boil at that point for sure. It's likely, if it's boiled at that temperature twice, it's likely to boil then, but we don't know for sure if it will, because maybe after you boil this substance a couple of times, it changes its structure or something like this, and it boils at a different temperature the third time. So when you're applying new theories in science, we're dealing with inductive arguments, but when you're simply applying well-established scientific principles, like here in terms of boiling water, we're dealing with a deductive argument.